Good.
Okay. Sorry, Joe.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, we have, I'm very, very excited and glad that he accepted to come. So we have Adam Bunch with us today. He's, you know, he's an award-winning storyteller who brings the history of Toronto and Canada to life. He's the author of two books, the Toronto Book of the Dead, and I believe that's what he will be mostly talking to us tonight, and the Toronto Book of Love, which came out just a few months ago. And he's also the host of the Canadiana documentary series, and I highly encourage you to go. It's on YouTube, so you can just search for Canadiana, and they're all there. It's all vignettes. Some are 2 minutes, some are 15 minutes, and it's amazing. So I think I watched them all, and it's very exciting. So and the creator, he's also the creator of the Toronto Dreams Project that you might have heard about as a few years back. He's taught history at the George Brown College and created writing workshops at the Toronto Public Library. He's spoken at the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Royal Ontario Museum. I know I was there. And his writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, Spacing Magazine, and the Huffington Post. His work popularizing Canadian history was recognized by an honorable mention for a Governor General Awards in 2012. So, welcome to virtual Cabbagetown, Adam, and take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am especially excited to be talking to you tonight because I haven't shared these particular stories or really talked about my first book, the Toronto Book of the Dead, since before the pandemic started. So it's been a while since I've been able to tell these particular stories. So I'm especially excited to tell them to you. I've spent a little time making the slides a little fancier and adding some more stories, especially ones about Cabbagetown. So I should probably dive into it because I've crammed it full of as many stories as I think I can get away with trying to tell over the course of an hour. So let me share my screen. Oh, sorry, it does not actually let me do that. I think a host might need to give me that.
Yeah.
Yes,
Steve.
That's true.
Yeah.
Hang on. One moment.
I think
Adam, you are now the host.
There we go. So I should say too, some of the slides, you might get a little blocked on the right-hand side of your screen if there are a bunch of boxes there, but you should be able to hide it with the buttons at the top or click and drag it around if you're not able to see anything. And this is where I like to start talking about the Toronto Book of the Dead, which is the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood. This is essentially where Toronto started when it was first founded as the little town of York in the late 1700s. It was about 10 square blocks that were first laid out, and they included the blocks around this neck of the woods. You can see the big spire of St. James Cathedral there, sort of in the middle of the photo. And so this is the oldest neighborhood in Toronto. And you can see by the end of the 1800s, which is when this photo was taken in the 1890s, it had grown into sort of a big commercial center. King Street, sort of the old main street of Toronto in the Victorian era. And it was filled with all these gorgeous old Victorian houses. But as I suspect the members of the CPA might have heard before, Toronto hasn't always done a particularly good job of preserving its history, whether that's stories that have been passed down through generations or built heritage. So the neighborhood that's Toronto's oldest neighborhood that could have maybe become our answer to something like old Montreal, instead, a century later, looked like this. This is that same neighborhood in the 1980s. You can see St. James Cathedral is just on the very, very left-hand edge of this photo. And while there are still a few old buildings left, that's the Flatiron Building, the Goodrum Building there in the triangle of land near the middle of the photo, and St. Lawrence Market just up from that. St. Lawrence Hall is still in there too. A lot of that old heritage had been demolished and demolished to make way for parking above anything else. And this, I think, is one of the starkest visual reminders you could have of the fact that Toronto has this reputation as historically being pretty bad at preserving our history. And over the years, there have been lots of different theories presented as to why that might be. Probably the most common one is that Toronto has a colonial mentality, that it was founded back in the late 1700s by the guy in the middle there with his pointing stick. That's John Graves Simcoe, the founder of Toronto, the first lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, as he builds Fort York, which back then was, as I say, just a tiny little town. It was really on the very edges of the British Empire. This is what it looked like at the very beginning of the 1800s. Really just a few scattered buildings along the lake. That's Front Street running right through the middle of the image there. And throughout most of its history, Toronto's really looked elsewhere to be sort of the center of power and sort of the center of storytelling. In Toronto's early years, it was probably London more than anywhere else as the colonial capital, and then New York more recently. So a lot of people would suggest that Toronto's never really taken itself seriously as a big city, and that our stories have seemed kind of quaint and provincial compared to these great big stories from cities like London and New York. Some people too, and Stephen, actually, you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking, mentioned how gross the city used to be and what that meant in terms of the heritage too. So this is what the skyline of Toronto looked like in 1912, filled, just choked with smoke, coal smoke, fumes and sewage. And by even the late 1900s, a lot of the heritage buildings looked like this. This is Union Station in the 1970s, and lots of those old heritage buildings looked like this. And I suspect it's a lot easier to knock them down when they look like this than when they've been properly cared for and cleaned and are as pretty as Union Station's facade is today. In fact, even the people who you would think would be most excited about sharing Toronto's stories and its history haven't always really lived up to that expectation. And one of the big stories of that happened in the 1880s when Toronto threw itself its very first big birthday party. It was 1888, and it was, I think, a week-long celebration. There were big parades and speeches and ceremonies, all celebrating the history of the city and its future as well. But it didn't do a particularly honest or thorough job of celebrating that history. A lot of it was twisting the city's history, erasing the indigenous people. And when they did include them, they were very much sort of a sideshow to the story that has traditionally been told about settlers arriving in this place on the northern shores of Lake Ontario and bringing British civilization to the grateful local people. But maybe most eye-raising of all is the date they chose to celebrate for Toronto's birthday. Toronto had been around by that time for about 90 years, but they chose to celebrate the city's 50th birthday instead. And the moment they chose to recognize as the birth of Toronto wasn't when it was founded in the late 1700s, a frontier town built on Indigenous land. It was 1834, 40 years later, when the town was already home to 10,000 people and went from being a town to a city with the act of incorporation, which led to particularly exciting and riveting floats in the parade like this one, which shows the moment that that bill received royal assent from Queen Victoria. And they had one of the big speakers be, appropriately enough, the very first history professor at U of T. He was the first history professor, the very first English professor. This quite friendly looking fellow is Sir Daniel Wilson. He was also the first president of U of T, actually the guy who coined the term prehistory in the English language, one of the big academic figures in all of Toronto history, was asked to give a talk about appreciating the history of the city. And the talk he gave instead suggested that Toronto really had no history at all. He said that Torontonians scarcely had a past and no record they needed to look back upon, that it was just great white sheets spread before them upon which they had to write the record of their city. Again, this is the 1880s. More than 100,000 people lived here. There had been an invasion by the Americans, a rebellion in the 1830s. There had been plagues and thousands and thousands of years of indigenous history before the city was even founded, of course, that he all just dismissed. And this was the first history professor at U of T, the person who you would think would be invested in the idea of the city's history. Even he didn't really think it was that important. But there's one other reason Toronto might not have taken its history that seriously that I talk about in my book, and I'll talk about a bit tonight. And that's the way Toronto has treated its dead and how that has changed over the course of the last 2 centuries or so. So back when Toronto looked like this in the very early 1800s, when it was the town of York and home to just hundreds and then thousands and then even tens of thousands of people, cemeteries looked a lot different than we think of them as being today. They were frequently small, little graveyards sitting outside your local church. Some people even had tombs and small family cemeteries on their own property, right outside their doors. And even if it was at the church, it was something you would see all the time. At a time when religion was so much more popular than it is today, it meant that every week, every Sunday, you were passing by this little graveyard filled with the city's ancestors, some of whom were likely to be your own ancestors, and they were there reminding you of your own past and of the city's past on at least a weekly basis. But over the course of the 1800s, that all changed. And Toronto went from looking like this when Simcoe arrived to found the town in the summer of 1793 to 100 years later, looking like this. This is Toronto at the end of the 1800s, when it was now home to about 200,000 people. And believe it or not, every single one of those people was going to die eventually, and they were all going to need somewhere to go. So those little church graveyards became pretty crowded and overwhelmed. For instance, you can take this one in Scarborough, Knox United Church, that used to have a churchyard that looked like that and has now been filled in with graves. Especially in the heart of town, in the town of York, in the booming city of Toronto in the late 1800s, things were getting very, very full. There wasn't enough room to bury all the dead. Some were being buried in shallow graves during big emergencies like the cholera pandemic in the 1830s. There was even a big mass grave dug right next to what's now St. James Cathedral. It's said that there are still those bodies in that mass grave buried under St. James Park to this day. And with a lot of these sort of quick, shallow burials, you were in danger. You were just, a curious dog or a heavy rainfall away from becoming unexpectedly face to face with your dearly departed grandmother who had died years earlier. And it wasn't safe or healthy for public health concerns either to have these graves that were so easily uncovered. So a solution needed to be found, and the Victorians found it in what became known as the Cemetery Beautiful movement. These big Victorian cemeteries, which will be familiar to residents of Cabbagetown, places like the Necropolis. There were big green spaces outside what was then the city center, places where there was a lot more room and would be for a long time to come. In fact, we're really only just now starting to run into trouble on a large scale of finding space in our old cemeteries. And they became sort of a refuge from people, not just somewhere to bury the dead, but somewhere for the living to enjoy too. In fact, Victorians used to like to spend a lot of their free time in cemeteries. People could go visit their own dearly departed loved ones, and sometimes, like these people in this photo, have a picnic in the cemetery and enjoy the green space while they were there. And it meant that even though those sort of churchyard boneyards were no longer as popular or as vital as they once were, people were still connecting with these graveyards on a regular basis. And they were still filled with people who not only got to enjoy the green space, but also art in a time before there were public art galleries that they could visit. They would get to see the artwork of the headstones themselves, and with their history, both of their family, visiting their, the relatives they could remember, and ones even further back than that, and the history of the whole community, the whole city, all the people who are buried in those cemeteries. And those cemeteries are a particularly powerful storytelling tool, even to this day. And there are two right in your neck of the woods that are two of the cemeteries filled with some of the most fascinating people from the entire history of the city. So I thought I'd share a few stories from them with you tonight, from the Necropolis and just up Parliament, St. James Cemetery too. In fact, you can tell many of the most fascinating and most important stories in the history of Toronto while you're wandering through the graves of the Necropolis and St. James. So I thought I would spend part of my time tonight telling you one of those stories and how these two cemeteries, while you're wandering through them, you can sort of trace out the whole history of one of Toronto's biggest stories, the story of the rebellion in 1837. And it begins in the Necropolis with one of the best known graves, because beneath this Celtic cross, sort of toward the back of the Necropolis, as you start approaching the slope down into the valley, you'll find Toronto's first mayor, William Lloyd Mckenzie. He'd actually been born in Scotland, but had a bit of a turbulent youth. He was a drinker and a gambler who decided to start over and sort of get a fresh blank slate by moving to Canada and eventually settling in what was then the town of York, but was really not going to find any more peaceful a life here than he had back home, because here he got deeply involved in politics and couldn't stand the small group of sort of Tory elites who ran the town back in its early days, and started his own newspaper, the Colonial Advocate, to sort of hurl insults at them and advocate for democratic reform. He thought that that small group of elites and the British colonial government shouldn't get to have a veto over the elected assembly, and he was willing to argue pretty strongly in favor of it. So strongly, in fact, that when his peaceful efforts at democratic reform failed, he eventually turned to violence, as you may very well have heard. In December of 1837, he gathered an army of rebels on Yonge Street and marched down toward the capital, which was still a little further south than Eglinton, where they all gathered at Montgomery's Tavern. His plan was to go seize all the guns at City Hall, overthrow the colonial government, and establish an independent, democratic Canadian republic. And that, of course, is not what happened. They took a very long time marching down Yonge Street that day. Mckenzie was easily distracted. He'd been forced to march earlier than he meant to, so not all of his men were even there. And by the time they got down toward College Street, it was already dusk. And that's where they encountered the first small group of government supporters. And that was led by someone you can find just next door to the necropolis at St. James Cemetery, sitting in a beautiful spot looking out over sort of the Rosedale Valley, which is one of Toronto's earliest sheriffs, William Botsford Jarvis. He had led a small group of men out to Yonge Street, ready to meet Mackenzie's rebels as they marched down toward the capital, and opened fire when the rebels got close. And it was all a very confused affair. The rebels in the front row all fired back, and Jarvis's men all scattered in fear while Jarvis tried to call to them to stand and fight. But luckily for him, the rebels also scattered, because when the first row of men who had fired their first shots all dropped to one knee to reload their muskets, since it was dusk and hard to see, the men behind them all thought that those men were dropping not to one knee to reload their muskets, but were dropping because they'd been shot. And scared, they all fled in the opposite direction too. So thanks to Jarvis, even though it was a bit of a haphazard affair, Toronto was saved from Mackenzie's attempted Canadian Revolution. And over the course of the night and through the next day, more and more reinforcements poured into Toronto. And by the following morning, so 2 days after Mackenzie's attempted attack, they had put together a big enough army to march up Yonge Street toward Montgomery's Tavern, the rebel stronghold. And that too, that army of government supporters was filled with people that you can now find in the necropolis and St. James. One of them sits sort of toward the middle north side of St. James, where he lays in the Jarvis family tomb. Jarvis is one of the most notorious names in all of Toronto history. His father, William, had been one of the original settlers, along with his wife, Mary, and taken sort of important government jobs, had been a real leading member of the family compact, that small clique that Mckenzie so hated. And his son, Samuel, who you can see here, sort of followed in his father's footsteps, a government official himself, sort of corrupt in a petty sort of way. The members of the family compact tended to give themselves all the best government jobs and try to keep a stranglehold on power and all the best land and appointments. And Jarvis, in fact, had killed a man, in fact, a boy, a 17-year-old John Rideout, in a very suspicious duel years earlier that had been one of the flashpoints on the road to rebellion. Although the thing that makes the Jarvises most notorious of all is the fact that they were among the few slave-holding families in the early history of our city. The Jarvises, like families like the Russells and the Bobbies, are on the list of those names that are currently being reconsidered by the city, who have big streets and other public places named after them because of the role they played in that early history of slavery in our city. Jarvis was among those sort of militiamen marching north on Yonge Street that day to face Mckenzie, but so were people with a very different relationship to slavery, including Wilson Ruffin Abbott, who is one of the great abolitionists in the history of Toronto. He'd grown up in the southern United States when he and his wife, a woman named Ellen Toyer, were driven out of the South by racist attacks. In fact, Southerners had burned down their general store in Mobile, Alabama. They had moved to New York City, found it still too racist there, and eventually came across the border and settled in Toronto, where they helped to make Toronto a more welcoming stop at the end of the Underground Railroad, and the people who would flee north to flee slavery in the following years. In fact, Wilson's son is probably better known than him. His son became the very first Black Canadian ever to graduate from medical school and would head back south to continue his family's legacy of fighting against American slavery by becoming a surgeon in the Union Army during the Civil War. He actually met and became friends with Abraham Lincoln and was there at the rooming house the night that Lincoln died after having been shot at the theater across the street, which is one of the chapters in the Toronto Book of the Dead. But it was his dad who was there decades later, marching with that group of government supporters to go put down the rebellion of 1837, marching on Montgomery's Tavern, as I say, which was just north of Eglinton. It was the site of many years of a post office, just a few blocks north of Eglinton. Today, there's a condo building on that spot, but they've preserved the facade that stands on the spot where the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern broke out as the government army reached the rebels. And it had been a very long buildup, decades of tension finally boiling over into the rebellion. But in the end, it only took 15 or 20 minutes before the battle was over. The government's cannons smashed through windows and walls. Rebels were jumping out of the windows, trying to flee to safety. The government, won that battle in 15 or 20 minutes and burned the tavern to the ground. The lucky rebels were the ones who managed to escape. And that included their leader, William Lloyd Mckenzie, who'd been appointed mayor a few years earlier and was now the most wanted man in the entire province, with £1,000 in this wanted poster calling for his capture. He sort of snuck through the countryside over the course of the next few days, mostly moving under the cover of darkness until he managed to find a supporter who rowed him across the Niagara River at night into the United States and safety. But even then, he didn't give up on his dream of this Canadian Revolution. Instead of just settling into a new life in the United States, he headed to this spot. This is Navy Island, which is in the middle of the Niagara River, just up from the falls. And this is where he launched his second wave of rebellion. He issued a proclamation in which he declared this to be the territory of the new Republic of Canada, said he wasn't giving up on the revolution at all. He even came up with a new flag and flew it there on Navy Island and used it as a base from which to keep the rebellion going. In fact, it would carry on even without Mackenzie's input the entire time for another year, what's become known as the Patriot Wars, which are a bunch of sort of tiny invasions along the border, along the St. Lawrence and at Windsor, as they kept trying to overthrow the government with a lot of American support. And it was here at Navy Island that Mckenzie was reunited with his wife for the first time since he had launched the rebellion. She had stood up to some of the governor's soldiers who searched their home on York Street, not far from Osgoode Hall, had managed to burn some of Mackenzie's papers before they were discovered. And when she heard her husband was alive, rushed to Navy Island to help. She had never really asked for any of this. She had come to Canada to marry Mckenzie, having only met him when they were little kids going to school together. It was his mom in Scotland who convinced her to go move to Canada to marry Mckenzie in an attempt to sort of calm him down and quiet his wild ways. She had no way of knowing that she was going to marry and spend her life with the most notorious agitator in the entire province. But she was also a very strong supporter of his ideas and of that cause of Canadian democracy. So when she headed to Navy Island, she was fully supportive. There's stories of her sewing her petticoats into ammunition bags. There's stories of them living in a little shack on the island and her making dinner while shells came falling through the ceiling and into her pots while the government troops shelled them from the Canadian side. And in the end, of course, it never did come to anything. They eventually ended up moving to Rochester and New York City, where they would spend the next decade living in exile, no longer welcome in the city they loved. And it wasn't until, I think it's 1849, that the old rebels were finally pardoned when the Mackenzies could come home to Toronto, where their supporters bought them a house, which is today the Mckenzie House Museum, which stands on Bond Street, sort of just next to Yonge and Dundas Square, where you can still to this day find Mackenzie's own copy of his wanted poster hanging on their dining room wall. And thanks to that pardon and the fact they were able to come home to Toronto, that's how Mckenzie is able to rest in peace in the Necropolis. And he's not alone down there. His wife, Isabel Baxter Mckenzie, is down there with him. And they're not the only rebels you'll find in the Necropolis either. Mckenzie, as I say, was one of the lucky ones who managed to escape at the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, but not all the rebels were so lucky. In fact, even people who weren't rebels, but were just suspected of being rebel sympathizers, were rounded up, almost about 1,000 people thrown into jail. So many that the Toronto jail on King Street, not far from Church, was overflowing. They ended up having to keep some of the prisoners in the Parliament buildings because there wasn't any room. And 2 rebels in particular were fingered for especially brutal punishment: Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews. Lount was a blacksmith who spent his weeks leading up to the rebellion forging pikes at his blacksmith north of the city. Peter Matthews was a farmer who had gone to the Don Valley to burn a bridge as a distraction, hoping that the decoy would draw some of the government forces there instead of marching north on Montgomery's Tavern. And they were the 2 that were going to be made an example of. Since the government didn't have Mckenzie to punish, they'd punish Lount and Matthews instead. So many of the rebels ended up being sent into exile to the United States or to Bermuda. Some were even sent to the penal colonies of Australia, to the brutal conditions there where some of them would die. But Lount and Matthews were sentenced to hang. Lount's wife, Elizabeth, presented the governor with a petition begging for mercy. She literally got down on her knees to beg him to spare her husband's life, with a petition signed by tens of thousands of Upper Canadians in support. But the governor denied her request, and Lount and Matthews were both hanged there on King Street in front of a public audience in 1830. 1838. The family, in fact, didn't even get to have a proper funeral. The government was afraid that if a big public funeral was held, it would become a rallying point for democratic reform support, and that Lount and Matthews would become martyrs to the cause. So they were buried privately, very quietly, in the old Paupers Cemetery at Young and Bloor. And the only gravestone they got was this very small, modest, flat stone to mark their grave. The government hoped that they would be forgotten, but that's not what's happened at all. Eventually, that Paupers Cemetery at Young and Bloor was closed since there was a central intersection and they wanted to use that real estate for new developments. And all the dead of Yorkville were moved down into the necropolis instead. And that included Lount and Matthews. And instead of being forgotten, their grave there was very well remembered. In fact, today, it's got a giant column marking the spot where they rest, erected decades later by supporters of their cause. And they even have an official government plaque calling them Patriots of 1837. So that today, the grave of Lount and Matthews, instead of being discreetly tucked away and forgotten, is one of the most easily spotted graves in the entire necropolis. Their defense lawyer, you will also find next door at St. James Cemetery. His name was Robert Baldwin. And he's one of my favorite stories from the entire history of the city. He was born in the very first generation of settlers back when Toronto looked like this, and grew up here when it was a very small town. His dad was one of the big reform supporters, but a moderate who didn't support the violence that Mckenzie did. And Baldwin would grow up to take on that mantle. He'd been the defense lawyer for Lount and Matthews. He tried to negotiate a peace during the rebellion, meeting with both sides, and had been a part of almost every big event in the history of Toronto during his entire lifetime. But the thing that was most important to him was love. He was an incredibly romantic young man who was always falling head over heels with girls as a teenager, but no one ever as much as his own cousin, Eliza. She was a bit younger than him, and as I say, his cousin. So their families, or I should actually say their family, since they were so closely related, did not approve of the match. So it was a bit of a forbidden love. The family sent Eliza away to stay with relatives in New York City, hoping that the distance would cool their passion and help Robert and Eliza forget each other. And that's not what happened at all. Instead, they sent love letters back and forth between Toronto and New York. They arranged to have one evening every month where they knew that they were thinking of each other so that they would feel connected across all that distance. And if anything, it made them closer than ever before and gave the romantic, sort of poetic Baldwin this story of forbidden love that I can only imagine made him even more into his cousin than he had been before. And eventually, the family gave up, and Eliza came back to town, and Robert and his love were married at Toronto's very first church, St. James, the old wooden church that was erected in the early 1800s that's still marked today by the spot where St. James Cathedral stands, the modern version of this tiny little log church from 200 years ago. It was a pretty muted affair, not just because their family didn't agree with the match, but also because Baldwin's best man seems to have been in love with him, which is something I write about in the Toronto Book of Love, and sort of begrudgingly stood there at the altar supporting his friend before moving away to Kingston and becoming the political opposite of everything Robert Baldwin stood for, one of the most conservative Tories in the province, who became sort of a bitter, hardened drinker, unhappily married until the end of his days. But the Baldwins in their new life was very happy. They were deeply in love, had a whole family and children, lived together downtown, and enjoyed the Baldwin family's country estate just outside of town back then, which is Spadina House, sort of the original version of the newer house, which stands on that spot today and is another city museum. But that happy life together didn't last very long, because one of those children that Eliza gave birth to had a particularly difficult childbirth, and she had to have a cesarean section, which in those days was incredibly dangerous, and her wound never fully healed. It got infected, and over the course of the next 2 painful years, Eliza Baldwin suffered and eventually died, and left Robert Baldwin, this deeply romantic man, unbelievably hurt and heartbroken, as you can imagine. And the rest of his life, he would be deep in mourning. He would carry Eliza's love letters in his jacket pocket everywhere he went. There are stories of him when he became a politician being in Parliament and falling asleep because he couldn't get any sleep at home. He was plagued by nightmares. He could be seen every year on the anniversary of their wedding, wandering through the streets of Toronto. It's actually coming up just next Tuesday, where he'd visit all the landmarks of their relationship, starting at St. James Church and wandering to their old home on Front Street all the way up to Spadina House, where he kept her old room untouched as a shrine that only he was able to enter. And that deep depression made the rest of his life a painful exercise, even as he was fighting for democratic reform and on his way to becoming one of the single most landmark, most influential politicians in the history of our country. Because in the wake of the rebellion, all the most radical reformers were gone. They'd either been arrested or had to flee into exile or been forcibly exiled. And it was the moderates like Baldwin who were left. And even they would find a fierce fight on their hands to bring in the big idea that Baldwin supported, the idea of responsible government, the idea that ministers and the government as a whole should be responsible to the elected representatives, responsible to the people, truly democratic, instead of letting the governor and the British colonial government have a veto over anything that the elected representatives wanted to pass. And this was the thing that Baldwin would spend the rest of his life fighting for and eventually winning. He teamed up with one of the big Montreal reformer, another moderate who was left in charge after their own rebellion there at the same time as Mckenzie's. And he and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine teamed up, sort of crossing religious, cultural, linguistic barriers in defiance of the Tories to bring in responsible government. In fact, at one point, there's a story of Baldwin inviting Lafontaine to come and run here in a riding in Toronto, which he won, this French Catholic Francophone winning in Protestant Anglophone Tory Toronto, which helped on the road to eventually getting what they wanted, which was the ability to pass laws that the Governor General wouldn't veto just because he disagreed with it. And the day that happened, just to show how much of a struggle this was and how dangerous a life Baldwin was leading, despite the fact that he was suffering so deeply from the loss of his wife, that when Lord Elgin, the Governor General, signed off on the bill that meant that Canada really was a democracy, there was a Tory mob waiting outside the Parliament buildings in Montreal by the time he left the building, pelted his carriage with insults and rocks. His wife actually kept some of the rocks and labeled them. I think you can see them on display at the Canadian History Museum in Ottawa. Later, there'd be a gunfight at LaFontaine's house. They'd open fire. You can still see, it's recently been restored, but you can still see the pockmarks left behind by the bullets that were shot into the facade of the house. And that night, a mob attacked the Parliament buildings while they were in session and burned them to the ground, with their elected representatives fleeing to safety, trying to save whatever artifacts they could. So that in the end, the capital had to move back to Toronto after spending some time in Montreal. But Baldwin and LaFontaine refused to answer with violence. There's a book about them written by John Ralston Saul, where he argues that it's the moment that the idea of violence as a last resort and not a first resort was sort of written into the Canadian identity. And the fight for responsible government had been won, and Canada had really achieved its first big step on the road to independence and to being a true democracy. Of course, there was a lot more to be done, like letting more people vote than just the wealthy white landowners, men who were able to at the time. Baldwin and LaFontaine both retired not long after, and Baldwin really dedicated himself even more strongly to remembering his wife, and seems to have been longing for the death that came just a few years later, when he finally passed away and was laid to rest in the family's tomb, which back then was on their own property at Spadina House. This is the original Spadina House before it was demolished and rebuilt by the Austin family, the Consumers Gas family, who built the current Spadina House. And it was just a few weeks after Robert Baldwin was laid to rest that his family found a note in one of his pockets, and it laid out a list of all his final requests. A lot of them were pretty reasonable, ordinary things. He wanted to be buried with the love letters that he'd kept in his pocket from his beloved Eliza. He wanted to be buried with the locket that she'd given him as a gift. But some of them, two of his requests in particular, were deeply bizarre. One of them was that he wanted his coffin to be chained to Eliza's coffin so that they would be together forever. But even stranger than that, he wanted his corpse to be given the same kind of cesarean section wound that had killed Eliza. And he was very clear in this note that he wanted that done, even if the note wasn't found until after he'd been laid to rest. So it was weeks after he was buried in that family tomb that some of the Baldwin family had to descend back down into it with a doctor and a scalpel and crack Baldwin's coffin back open, split across his stomach that wound that he had requested, before closing his coffin back up and then chaining him to the coffin of his beloved Eliza. And in time, that family tomb with those two bodies chained together within it was removed from the grounds of Spadina House and moved to the St. James Cemetery instead. So today, you can find that Baldwin Spadina vault sort of toward the back, the sort of the southeast corner of St. James, if you'd like to visit it yourself, just behind a big granite pillar. Baldwin's father, who's a big reformer and doctor and architect, is down there too, William Warren Baldwin, and their family friend, Peter Russell, who is also another one of the big slaveholders in the early city. It's definitely one of the most fascinating grave plots in the city, right there in St. James. But over the course of the 1900s, and as time moved on, and in the decades after Baldwin died, fewer and fewer people were spending time in these cemeteries and connecting with these stories. There were new ways to spend your time and get what people used to get from cemeteries. There were now big green public spaces like Hyde Park that had been opened in 1876. There were now the first art galleries like the AGO and museums like the ROM, so that you could connect with art and history without having to go spend your time somewhere quite as morbid as a cemetery. And those picnickers who had spent all those long afternoons in cemeteries like the Necropolis and St. James stopped doing that, and it started seeming like a weird thing to do. And in time, there became a bigger division between the land of the living and the land of the dead that was reinforced by the fact that they were these green spaces, sort of cities of the dead unto themselves, which is literally what necropolis means. And it really is kind of its own city. There are more people dead in the necropolis today than there are people currently living in the entire city of Fredericton. And they're kept sort of away from our everyday lives behind these iron fences. And the strongest symbol of this, I think, is this gorgeous entrance to the necropolis, which feels as you pass through it like a portal into another world. And on the other side, you're in the land of the dead, and in this quiet space that's now been swallowed up by the city and sits very much in the middle of it, that was once outside the city itself. But that division between the city of the dead and the city of the living is also very much an illusion. So that's a lot of what I have tried to do with the Toronto Book of the Dead, is not just tell the stories of the people who are lying in those cemeteries, but also show how they're connected to the city around us. Every city is a city of the dead, and it's not just kept safe behind those iron fences. Their stories surround us. Our city was built by the people who have come before us, the people who rest in those cemeteries and those churchyard graves and mass graves like the one under St. James Park and other burial places all around the city. This is one of them from long before Toronto was founded. This is a place called Tabor Hill, which is right near the corner of Lawrence and Bellamy Road in Scarborough. And it's surrounded by bungalows in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. And it was all built, this neighborhood of Bendale, in the 1950s. And as they were leveling the terrain to build the subdivision and using the extra earth to fill in the land where they were building the 401 at the exact same time, when they carved into this particular hill, they were startled to find inside the bones of hundreds of people. And they eventually realized that this was a burial mound from long ago Wendat history, from about 700 years ago. But these hundreds of people were laid to rest in the 1300s, so centuries before the first Europeans had come anywhere near this part of the world, in a feast of the dead, which is what the first French missionaries called it, which is when a group of Wendat villages. At the end of every Wendat village would last maybe about 15 or 20 years before moving to a new location. And during those years, the dead would be laid to rest in cedar coffins at the edge of town on raised platforms. When it was time for the village to move, the dead would be brought back out and all laid to rest together, their bones intermingled in one large communal grave. And in fact, in later centuries, by the time those French missionaries arrived to start writing down the accounts, which is where a lot of our information comes from, neighboring villages would all bring their dead together in one big communal grave where these bones and souls would intermingle as a sign of connection between communities. And in the end, that burial mound in Scarborough, which was once the site of a Feast of the Dead, was left there in the middle of the neighborhood of Bendale. And today it looks like an ordinary park, but is in fact a sacred burial site. There are signs posted all around it reminding you not to toboggan on a hill that many people don't realize has this deep connection to the history of this place from long before any of the first settlers arrived. And there are more stories of the dead pretty much everywhere you go in the city. There's the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse out on the island, which was once a beacon in this vital spot at the mouth of the harbor, especially during the War of 1812, when Toronto was a big naval center and there were naval battles happening just off our shores, where one of Toronto's most notorious murders took place on a New Year's Eve, right at the end of the war, when two soldiers from Fort York stopped by to visit the first lightkeeper, J.P. Radelmuller, who brewed beer out there at his lightkeeper's cottage on the island. And when he cut them off, these two soldiers, they're said to have gotten not just angry and belligerent, but violent. And eventually, according to the stories, though we're not entirely sure how the murder really took place, chased him up the steps of the lighthouse and pushed him to his death before dismembering his body and burying various parts of him all around the island that people have been looking for ever since, and then making a quick disappearance before they could be caught, which has led to one of Toronto's biggest ghost stories. People like to say that on a misty evening out by the lighthouse at Gibraltar Point, on some nights you might see a light from the lighthouse, even though no one's there, or see his blood stains on the wooden steps inside, or even meet Radelmuller himself without his arms as he searches for his missing limbs in the sands of the island, which is a story that's been passed down from generation to generation. In fact, for a long time, people thought it was entirely untrue. It wasn't until pretty recently that concrete evidence of the murder and newspaper reports from the time were finally unearthed. But that story has been part of the lore of the lighthouse anyway, ever since, all the way through the 1950s and 60s when the lighthouse was finally decommissioned, and is still very much a part of the history of the lighthouse today. It's still standing there. The shoreline has moved now and it's surrounded by trees. And still the second oldest lighthouse actually anywhere in Canada, and the oldest on the Great Lakes, and the only place in Toronto where I believe you can find a ghost story officially referenced on a heritage plaque that stands on the side of the building, one that created huge controversy when it was originally erected. There were huge debates with at least one city councillor saying that it was far too scary a fact to include in a heritage plaque, and that it would scare children away from visiting the lighthouse. A city councillor who clearly has never met a child in his life and is part of the story of this building that can connect us to that time in the early 1800s. I'll quickly just mention a few others before ending. One of my favorites is this pretty nondescript looking house on Euclid Avenue, just a few steps north of Queen, the very first building on the west side of Euclid, north of Queen, once belonged to a U of T professor by the name of Watson, who had a protege in sort of the final days of the First World War, who became the most famous medium in Toronto. And in those of grieving days in the wake of the war, and while the Spanish flu was still at its height, if you wanted to speak to the dead, this house on Euclid is where you would come, where Louis Benjamin, the medium, would use a Ouija board to contact the dead spirits who he said lived in a place called the 20th plane, with pink skies, where they all lived on liquid rice and traveled with the power of thought. As people started questioning whether this was all real or maybe a bit of a scam perpetrated on a grieving city, people started trying to test them and ask them to contact their own dead friends and relatives. But Dr. Watson and Benjamin, sadly, could only ever contact extremely famous dead people like Abraham Lincoln and Jesus, providing people at the seances with facts that critics suggested you could all find in an encyclopedia pretty easily, but who still managed to sell out speaking engagements, publish multiple books. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle checked in on one of the seances. Lucy Maud Montgomery read one of the books. And she's actually got her own house. That's another site I talk about in the Book of the Dead, which is on the west side on Riverside Drive, which runs along the east side of the Humber, south of Bloor, which was the last home that Lucy Maud Montgomery ever lived in. She's been famous, of course, for her years in PEI, but she was actually writing Anne of Green Gables novels and stories right up to the very end of her life when she lived here at the house she called Journey's End because she knew it would be her final house. It's mostly a very deeply sad story. She was suffering from severe depression by the time she lived here and was heartbroken by the outbreak of the Second World War. She'd been a supporter of the First World War, had written about it in some of the Anne books, because it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But instead, of course, it was not long before the Second World War broke out, leaving her deeply depressed. The very last thing that Anne of Green Gables ever says in any of her books is that she's glad that her son died during the First World War, so he didn't have to live to see that the Second World War had happened. And the day that that manuscript arrived on her publisher's desk, Lucy Maud Montgomery was found dead in bed at Journey's End, with a half-empty bottle of pills and a note of desperation on her bedside. A secret that was kept by the family for decades until the early 2000s, when her granddaughter finally went public, sharing the fact that her grandmother had likely died from suicide as an attempt to try to remove some of the stigma around mental illness and show that even someone as successful as Lucy Maud Montgomery had to suffer those battles. And the book ends here with one of the most modern landmarks in our city, the TD Center, the first of the big modernist bank towers that went up downtown, that for a while looked like, if you can have two monoliths, like a pair of monoliths from 2001 towering over downtown, built by the legendary architect, Mies van der Rohe, were the site of one of Toronto's most absurd deaths in 1993. There was a law firm up there, I think on the 28th floor, maybe somewhere in the 20s, where a lawyer named Gary Hoy worked. He liked to impress articling students. Every year, his law firm would have a day where they'd invite students in and show them around. in the attempt of wooing the most promising ones to come and work for the firm. And Gary Hoy, every year, which is a story some of you may have heard, would go in the big boardroom and impress these students with how well built the TD Center was, especially how strong the glass in these windows were. So he would take a running start across the boardroom and throw himself into the window. And every year, year after year, he would just bounce harmlessly off the window because the TD Center really was very well built, and that glass never did ever break. What did happen, though, when he tried to do this in 1993, is that the entire window popped out of its frame. So the Gary Hoy and that pane of glass, like the opening credits of Mad Men, fell all the way down from the TD Center to ignominious end on the concrete below. He won, I believe, the Darwin Award for the most absurd self-inflicted death of the year in 1993, and is something that's also a story that's been passed down ever since. A lot of people think it's an urban legend, but it's something that really did happen. In fact, his whole law firm ended up having to fold and go out of business because it was such a deep blow, and people were led to question the decision-making of at least Gary Hoy within that firm. So that's where the Book of the Dead ends. There are lots and lots more stories in it, but hopefully a little bit of sharing some of the stories that are not just held within the cemeteries in your neck of the woods, but helped break down that barrier between the city of the living and the city of the dead, and shared some stories outside it as well. If you're interested in the book or any of my other work, they're both the Book of the Dead and the Book of Love, which both tell sort of the whole history of the city through stories of death and love from before it was founded to today. Every chapter is a new story. They're both available at all of the usual places. And I'm up to lots of other stuff too. I've now got a Toronto History newsletter that you can go subscribe to called the Toronto History Weekly, where every week I share heritage news and stories that are sort of tied to what's new in the world of Toronto history, all free to subscribe to. It's a paid option if you want to support it, but you can get it every week and keep up to date with everything that's new in Toronto history right into your inbox. As Gilles was saying, I'm also the host of a documentary series called Canadiana, which is also totally free to watch on YouTube. There are 2 full seasons already up there, but we spent a lot of last year running across the country, just exhausting ourselves, filming another 20 new episodes that are about to start going up in just a few weeks. I think the first one's going to be on June 28th, talking about the history of piracy on the East Coast. So you can check all those out and subscribe for free to that as well. I also do a bunch of online courses. So if you're just interested in hearing more stories like the stuff I was telling you today, I have one that sort of covers the whole history of the city. That's over 10 weeks from Hogtown to downtown. But I've got others coming up later this week about the history of baseball in Toronto. I've got one about Toronto's most notorious murders. I think I'm going to do a new one all about booze and alcohol in the history of the city. And you don't need to remember how to Google any of that because you can find it all on my website, adammunch.com, where there are links to all of my different projects and anything you might be interested in that I'm up to. Or you can follow me on social media at TO Dreams Project. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening to all those stories. It was an absolute delight to share them with you. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I will stop sharing my screen. Oh, there we go. So thank you again so much for your attention for the last hour or however long I talked. It has been really a pleasure.
So if you want to come and hear more about the Necropolis, you can join me on June the 19th at 10:30.
Wonderful. Yeah, if people have not, I assume Cabbagetown people are all wandering the necropolis all the time, but if not, is absolutely one of my favorite spots in the entire city, even just to walk through without even all the stories that it's tied to.
That's it. The CPA walking tour will tell you all these stories again, plus some new ones at 10:30 on the 19th.
But I think, Adam, thank you. I mean, you kind of showed that, how wrong the professor you talked about at the beginning,
Yeah,
was
Daniel
about,
Wilson.
I mean, it's these are fascinating stories, and you turn a corner and there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. So thank you very much for this. Okay, and we'll be in touch.
Well,
Okay.
thank you so
Adam,
much for having me.
I have one question for you. What about youth? You get young people interested in your talks, in the stories. I wonder if it's people who've been around longer, who maybe have more invested in the city, who are so interested in these stories. Are we capturing the imagination of our younger population, and a population that's now so diverse?
I think Toronto's doing a better job of that more and more. I think, I could be wrong, but my very subjective impression is over the course of the last decade or so, the time I've been doing it, people are getting more interested in it. And there was a whole generation of people who started writing about the history of the city and sharing stories online in 2010-ish. So sites like Torontoist and Spacing started having writers who are really engaging and telling stories in this engaging way and online, which means being able to reach audiences of people of all ages, and especially young people, sort of right where they already were. And it happened at the same time that there was sort of a new generation that we were also hopefully a little prouder of Toronto, who hadn't grown up as much with Toronto's old reputation, who didn't know the story of Toronto the Good as viscerally as people who grew up during its heyday might, who I think stopped looking to places like New York as much and started forming their own scenes. So I think history was one part of it, but there was also, a new generation of music scene and lecture series and bar rooms and all sorts of new sort of cultural things happening, and sort of building on a lot of progress that had been made in decades since. So one of my favorite things to talk about is Yorkville and Yonge Street and the punk scene in the 70s, and all these moments where sort of that old conservative Toronto started getting chipped away at. And I think maybe young people today, as a result of sort of those movements over the last 50 years or so, are able to appreciate Toronto in a new way and are more interested in knowing about its history. And that includes people who are new Canadians, I think, who are interested to learn about this place that's their new home, that have new ways of engaging, and that people are doing a better job of actually telling. So one thing I write a lot about is sort of the statues at Queen's Park that have now become a big sort of flashpoint in discussion of Toronto history. That I think there's not a single person of color anywhere on the grounds of our provincial capital, our house. And I think only two women, one of whom is Queen Victoria, and one of whom is the figure of victory standing atop a monument dedicated to the soldiers who went to go fight against Louis Riel. And people are now starting to tell those stories, not just about those guys up on those pedestals, but all the people who've made Toronto what it is over the last 200 years and longer, since before the city was founded. So I've been going on a lot in this response, but something I'm very hopeful for the future, that people seem to be engaging with Toronto history, and it seems more contentious in a lot of ways, but I think that's in part because people care, and we're hearing from more voices and more people are engaging than I think have ever been able or been excited to engage before.
Great, good.
Thank you for including some references to slaveholders, to slavery, to some of the indigenous history. And I think there are a lot of stories with members of very diverse communities who have been here a long time. And finding those stories, and I know often those individual communities now are digging for those stories. So I think as more of those are included and we get a full picture, that will also bring younger people of all ages, really.
Yeah.
You were fantastic, though. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I absolutely agree. Toronto now has a monument dedicated to a Black historical figure for the first time, upon a permanent monument to Joshua Glover, which is in Etobicoke, right by Montgomery's Inn, not to be confused with Montgomery's Tavern, by a young, fresh artist. There's also, if you're really interested in the history of slavery in Toronto, I highly recommend following Natasha Henry's work, who's the president of the Ontario Black Historical Association, who's doing her PhD thesis all about the history of slavery in Toronto, which is a story that almost every time you mention slavery in Toronto, people are surprised to learn it, because it has been a story that has not been told nowhere near enough by the generations of historians before us.
Any other questions? Comments? Gilles, do you want to say the final words? And I thank everyone for coming, and I certainly thank Adam, and over to Gilles.
Yeah, I just, again, I'm totally, you confirm what I firmly believe, that, there's so many stories that are still untold. And I would say, Adam, you're one of those people who've been on digging those and giving them to us. So thank you so much for doing this for us tonight. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks for saying that. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so everybody, I guess we're gonna end on this one. Do you want to close it off, Gail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Steve, are you going to just close us all down? We can all say good night, and hope to see you all in the neighborhood, and certainly at the garden tour on June 6th. Let's hope for a sunny day.
Okay, Adam, can you give me back control, please? I'm completely
Oh.
out of control.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had it. You know how I do that?
I go to participants and find my name, Stephen Yates,
Okay.
and you should find
Make host.
more, and then you should find
I think I did it.
host. Oh, I'm
Ah,
thrilled.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Stop recording.